The year is 37 AD. Rome is the beating heart of the world, a city of marble and gold, of poets and generals, of gods and monsters. In the shadow of the Palatine Hill, the people gather in the streets, their voices rising in a single, desperate hope that the nightmare is finally over. The old emperor, Tiberius, is dead. The Senate has named a new ruler, a young man with the blood of heroes in his veins. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but the world will remember him by another name, a name whispered in fear, spat in disgust, and carved into the bones of history: Caligula. For a few brief months, Rome dares to believe in miracles. The city celebrates, statues are raised, prayers are offered. The son of Germanicus, the beloved general, has come to save them. But beneath the marble, beneath the gold, something rotten stirs. The boy who once wore little boots and played among the legions has returned, but he is not the same. The machine that devoured his family has remade him, piece by piece, into something Rome has never seen before. This is not the story of a madman. It is the story of a system of power wielded like a scalpel, of cruelty refined into art, of intimacy twisted into horror. These are the 5 most horrifying intimate acts of Emperor Caligula, acts that went so far beyond the boundaries of decency that even Rome, a city built on conquest and spectacle, recoiled in terror. If you think you know what absolute power looks like, think again. If you believe that history's darkest secrets are buried in dusty scrolls, you're about to learn how wrong you are. Because what Caligula did behind the closed doors of the Imperial Palace was not just pravity, it was a blueprint for the destruction of the human soul. Let's begin. Act 1. The Sister Goddess. Before Caligula became emperor, he was a survivor. At the age of 7, he watched his father Germanicus die under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered poison, others blamed the emperor himself. His mother was exiled, his brothers starved and tortured, his family erased one by one. By the time he reached adulthood, Caligula was the last of his line, a living ghost in a city that had murdered everyone he loved. But there was one person he clung to, his sister Drusilla. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio hinted a relationship that crossed every boundary. Even for Rome, whether the rumors of incest were true or the product of political slander, what matters is that Caligula did nothing to deny them. In fact, he encouraged the whispers, letting them swirl through the marble halls like poison. When Drusilla died, something inside Caligula shattered. He did not simply mourn her. He made the entire empire mourn with him. He ordered the Senate to declare Drusilla a goddess, the first Roman woman to be deified in her own lifetime. Temples were built, the statues were raised. Romans were commanded to worship her, to offer sacrifices, to bow before the memory of a woman whose greatest sin was loving her brother too much, or not enough. But Caligula's grief was not content with temples and prayers. He weaponized mourning itself. For weeks it was a capital crime to laugh, to bathe, to eat dinner with your family. Joy became treason. Every household in Rome was forced to share in his agony, to feel the weight of his loss, to live in the shadow of a love that had curdled into obsession. This was not madness. This was a lesson Caligula had learned from the machine that destroyed his family. The most intimate bonds can be twisted into instruments of power. By making Rome grieve for Drusilla, he proved that he could legislate emotion, criminalize happiness, and turn private pain into public terror. Act 2. The Imperial Brothel. If the cult of Drusilla was an act of psychological violence, what came next was something even darker. Caligula understood that in Rome, reputation was everything. The names of the great families were carved into the city's very stones. Honor was currency, and shame was a fate worse than death. So he built a machine to destroy honor itself. According to ancient sources, Caligula established a brothel inside the imperial palace not for his own pleasure, but as a weapon. The staff were not common prostitutes, but the sons and daughters of Rome's nobility. Senators, equestrians, even the wives and daughters of his closest advisors were forced to serve. Heralds announced their names and prices in the streets. Ledgers were kept, recording every transaction, every humiliation, every act of degradation. Imagine the horror. A senator's daughter, raised in luxury, paraded before the mob like livestock. A nobleman's wife, her name inscribed in a ledger for all to see. The very people who rule Rome reduced to commodities. Their bodies sold to the highest bidder, their shame immortalized in ink. This was not random cruelty. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and cold. Caligula understood that to truly break a person, you must take not just their body, but their name, their legacy, their place in the world. The imperial brothel was not a place of pleasure, it was a factory of despair. And the city watched. Some wept, some laughed, most simply endured, knowing that to protest was to invite the same fate. In the heart of the empire, intimacy became a weapon, and shame became the law. Act 3. The Banquet of Predation. But Caligula was not content with public humiliation. He craved something more intimate, more personal, more devastating. The imperial banquets became his stage, and the senators his unwilling audience. Picture the scene. 100 of Rome's most powerful men and their wives, gathered in a marble hall, the air thick with fear and the scent of spiced wine. Caligula moves among them, his eyes cold and appraising. He stops at a table, inspects a senator's wife as if she were a horse at auction, and without a word, leads her away. The room falls silent. The senator stares at his plate, his hands trembling. 20 minutes pass. When Caligula returns, he does not simply return the woman to her husband. He sits down, pours himself wine, and in front of everyone, describes in graphic detail what just happened behind closed doors. He rates her performance, makes jokes, compares her to other senators' wives, and the husband must smile, must nod, must thank the emperor for his attention, because the alternative is death. This was not madness. This was a system. Caligula had learned that the deepest wounds are inflicted not with swords, but with words, with the destruction of dignity, the annihilation of trust, the transformation of love into terror. The banquets became infamous, whispered about in the streets and recorded in the diaries of those who survived them. But what most Romans never understood was that these acts were not simply the whims of a madman, they were experiments. Caligula was testing the limits of human endurance, probing the boundaries of shame and loyalty, seeing how far he could push before something broke. And every time the answer was the same. No one dared resist. The city that had conquered the world could not defend itself against the emperor at its own table. But Caligula was not finished. He had learned that public humiliation was powerful, but private humiliation, witnessed by the public, was devastating. He had discovered that the bonds of marriage, of family, of friendship could be turned into weapons. And he was about to take that lesson to its logical, horrifying conclusion. Act 4. The Grieving Father. If there is one bond deeper than marriage, it is the bond between parent and child. Caligula understood this instinctively, perhaps because he had lost his own family so young. Perhaps because he had seen how grief could hollow out a person from the inside. And so he devised a new form of torture, one that would haunt Rome for generations. It began with executions, not for crimes, not for treason, but for amusement, for boredom, for the simple pleasure of watching others suffer. But Caligula added a twist. When a senator's son was condemned, the father was forced to watch, not from a distance, but up close, front row, with nowhere to hide. The execution was not swift or merciful. It was drawn out, calculated, designed to inflict maximum pain not just on the victim, but on the one who loved him most. But the true horror came after. That night, the grieving father would be summoned to the imperial palace for dinner, the body of his son still warm in the street, the memory of his screams still echoing in his ears. The father would be forced to sit at Caligula's table, to eat, to drink, to make conversation, and Caligula would watch him, studying his face, searching for any sign of grief, any flicker of pain, because if the father wept, if he faltered, if he showed even a hint of humanity, Caligula would know he had not yet broken him completely. So the father would sit, stone-faced, swallowing his agony, pretending that nothing had happened, while the man who had murdered his child smiled and poured him wine. This was not just cruelty, it was the systematic destruction of the human spirit. Caligula was teaching Rome that love itself was dangerous, that to care for someone was to give the emperor a weapon to use against you. And the lesson was learned. Senators became cautious, distant, afraid to show affection, afraid to form bonds, afraid to love. The city grew colder, harder, more suspicious. The machine was working. Act 5. The Machine of Intimacy. By now, Rome was a city in the grip of terror. But Caligula was not satisfied. He wanted to prove that there was no part of a person, no secret, no desire, no shame that he could not reach. And so he built his final, most horrifying act, the Machine of Intimacy. This was not a single event, but a system, a web of spies, informers, and secret police, all reporting directly to the emperor. Every household was watched. Every conversation was overheard. Every rumor, every whisper, every glance was noted and recorded. The walls themselves seemed to have ears, but Caligula's true genius was in making people complicit in their own destruction. He would invite senators and their families to the palace, shower them with gifts, flatter them, make them feel safe. Then, in the dead of night, he would summon them one by one, interrogate them about their private lives, their desires, their fears. He would force confessions, extract secrets, and then use those secrets as weapons, blackmailing, humiliating, destroying reputations with a single word. No one was safe. Husbands betrayed wives, fathers betrayed sons, friends turned on friends. The city became a labyrinth of suspicion and paranoia, a place where the most intimate acts, love, trust, confession became tools of the state. And through it all, Caligula watched, amused, delighted by the spectacle of a city devouring itself. He had learned from the monsters who came before him, but he had perfected their art. He had turned intimacy into a weapon, love into a liability, trust into a trap. The aftermath, when the machine breaks. But even the most perfect machine has a flaw. Caligula believed that fear would always win, that no one would ever dare to resist. He forgot the oldest rule of all: never corner something that can kill you. His downfall began with a joke. Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the Praetorian Guard, had a high-pitched voice. Caligula found this endlessly amusing. Day after day, he mocked Chaerea, assigning him passwords like Venus or Priapus, humiliating him in front of his men. For Caligula, it was nothing, a throwaway insult, a moment's amusement. For Chaerea, it was a drop of poison, a daily reminder that under this emperor, life was not worth living. On January 24, 41 AD, the machine broke. Caligula was leaving the theater, walking through a narrow corridor beneath the palace. The conspirators were waiting. Sharia stepped forward, asked for the password. And when Caligula sneered his reply, Sharia drove his sword up under the emperor's ribs. The others joined in. 30 stab wounds, 30 years of rage and humiliation unleashed in a single frenzied minute. But the violence did not end with Caligula. The conspirators found his wife Caesonia and murdered her. They found his young daughter, Julia Drusilla, and killed her too. The machine had devoured its creator, and now it turned on everything he loved. For a brief moment, Rome dared to hope that things would change. The Senate debated restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had other plans. They found Claudius Caligula's uncle hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor. The system survived. The machine found a new operator. The legacy, the blueprint of tyranny. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. In the vast sweep of Roman history, he was a blip, a footnote, a cautionary tale. But his legacy endured. He had shown the world that power, when wielded without restraint, could turn the most intimate acts, love, trust, grief, into instruments of terror. He had built a blueprint for tyranny, a machine that would be copied by monsters for centuries to come. Nero, who burned Rome and blamed the Christians. Domitian, who executed people for looking at him the wrong way. Commodus, who forced senators to watch him fight as a gladiator. Elagabalus, whose depravity defied description. All of them followed the path Caligula had blazed, and the lesson was clear. When one person controls everything, law, military, economy, culture, there is no limit to the horrors they can inflict. The only check on their power is death, and even then, the system endures. But what made Caligula's reign so uniquely horrifying was not just the scale of his cruelty, but the way he made the private public, the intimate political, the personal universal. He understood that the deepest wounds are not those inflicted by the sword, but those carved into the soul, and he wielded that knowledge with a precision that still chills the blood 2,000 years later. Let's return to the 5-act sequence. 1. A lesson in how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the boundaries of intimacy can be weaponized until nothing is sacred, nothing is safe. Act 1 Revisited. The sister goddess, the cult of Drusilla, was more than a display of grief, it was a declaration of ownership. By elevating his sister to the status of a goddess, Caligula blurred the lines between family, faith, and state. He forced Rome to participate in his private obsession, to bow before the altar of his loss, to worship at the feet of a love that defied every law, mortal and divine. But the true horror was not in the rumors of incest, nor in the temples built in Drusilla's name. It was in the way Caligula made the entire empire complicit in his mourning. He criminalized joy, legislated sorrow, and turned the city into a stage for his own suffering. Every Roman became an actor in his tragedy, every household a shrine to his pain, and when the mourning ended, the scars remained. Rome had learned that the emperor's grief was more powerful than any law, that his desires could reshape reality itself. The boundaries between public and private, sacred and profane, had been erased. Act 2 Revisited. The Imperial brothel. The brothel inside the palace was not just a place of sexual exploitation, it was a laboratory of humiliation. Caligula understood that the true currency of Rome was not gold, but reputation. By forcing the nobility to sell their bodies, he bankrupted the city's moral economy, reducing its greatest families to objects of ridicule and scorn. But the ledgers were the most chilling detail. Every act, every name, every shameful secret was recorded, catalogued, preserved. The brothel was not just a place of physical violation, but of bureaucratic violence, a reminder that the state could reach into the most private corners of a person's life and leave nothing untouched. For the victims, there was no escape. Their shame was immortalized, their dignity erased, their futures destroyed. And for the city, there was only silence. To protest was to invite the same fate. To speak out was to disappear. Act 3 Revisited. The banquet of predation. The banquets were more than spectacles of power, they were rituals of domination. Caligula did not simply violate the bodies of his subjects. He violated their minds, their marriages, their very sense of self. By forcing husbands to watch, by making wives the objects of public scrutiny, he shattered the bonds that held Roman society together. But the most insidious part was the aftermath. The victims were forced to smile, to laugh, to pretend that nothing had happened. The pain was not just physical, but psychologically slow, corrosive poison that ate away at the soul, and the city learned to live with it. The senators returned to their homes, their wives to their beds, their children to their studies, but nothing was ever the same. Trust was broken, love was tainted. The shadow of the emperor hung over every table, every marriage, every whispered conversation. Act 4 Revisited. The grieving father. The executions were not just acts of violence, they were experiments in despair. Caligula wanted to see how much a person could endure before breaking, how much grief a father could swallow before he choked. By forcing parents to witness the deaths of their children, and then to dine with their murderer, he turned love into a weapon, grief into a spectacle. But the true horror was in the silence. The fathers did not weep, the mothers did not scream, the city did not rise up. The machine had taught them that to show pain was to invite more pain, that to grieve was to die. And so Rome became a city of ghosts, living people who had learned to bury their emotions, to hide their hearts, to survive at any cost. The machine was working perfectly. Act 5 revisited. The machine of intimacy. The web of spies and informers was the final act, the culmination of everything Caligula had learned. By turning the most intimate acts, confession, trust, love, into tools of the state, he created a world where no one was safe, not even in their own minds. The city became a labyrinth of secrets and lies. Friends betrayed friends. Children betrayed parents. Husbands and wives slept side by side, each wondering if the other would be the one to denounce them. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, the shadows to listen. And through it all, Caligula watched, amused by the spectacle of a city devouring itself. He had become the architect of a new kind of tyranny, one that did not rely on armies or laws, but on the slow, relentless erosion of trust, the psychological blueprint. What made Caligula's system so effective was its psychological precision. He understood that the most intimate parts of a person, their loves, their fears, their secrets, were also their greatest vulnerabilities. By targeting those vulnerabilities, he could control not just bodies but minds. He did not need to kill everyone who opposed him. He only needed to make them afraid to love, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. The city policed itself, each citizen a warden of their own prison, and the legacy of that system endured long after Caligula's death. The emperors who followed him, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, perfected the art of psychological terror. The blueprint had been drawn, the machine built. All that was needed was a new operator, the human cost. But behind the machinery of power, behind the ledgers and the laws, were real people, men and women whose lives were shattered, whose families were destroyed, whose names were erased. The victims of Caligula's reign were not just statistics or footnotes. They were fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, sons and daughters. Their suffering was not just physical, but existential, a slow, suffocating descent into fear and silence. They learned to hide their pain, to bury their memories, to survive in a world where survival meant forgetting who you were. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the empire, there were moments of defiance, a whispered prayer, a stolen glance, a memory clung to in secret. The machine could break bodies, but it could not always break the spirit. The final lesson: memory and survival. Centuries have passed since Caligula's reign, but the echoes of his horrors still linger in the stones of Rome and in the stories we tell. His name has become a byword for depravity, for madness, for the dangers of unchecked power. But the true lesson of his rule is not just a warning about emperors or tyrants. It is a lesson about the fragility of the human soul and the resilience that sometimes survives even the worst darkness. History remembers Caligula as a monster, but monsters do not arise in a vacuum. He was shaped by a world that valued power above all else, that rewarded cruelty, that taught him to see intimacy as a weapon and love as a liability. The system that created him did not die with him. It lived on, evolving, adapting, finding new forms in new ages. But so did the resistance. The same Rome that cowered in fear also produced whispers of defiance, stories passed in secret, memories preserved in silence, small acts of courage that the machine could never fully erase. The ledgers of shame may have been burned, the victims' names forgotten, but the lesson endures. Even in the darkest times, the human spirit can carve out a space for dignity, for memory, for hope. Caligula's 5 most horrifying intimate acts were not just crimes against individuals, they were assaults on the very fabric of society, on the bonds that make us human. He showed the world how easily love can be twisted into pain, how quickly trust can become terror, how absolute power can turn the most private moments into public nightmares. But he also showed us something else, that the stories of the broken, the shamed, the silenced, can still reach across centuries to remind us what it means to be human, that memory is a form of resistance, that survival is sometimes as simple as refusing to forget. So as you finish this story, remember the lesson that Rome learned at such a terrible cost. Power can destroy, but it can never fully erase. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. If these stories move you, if they remind you of the cost of silence and the value of memory, then let them live on, share them, speak them. Refuse to let the final word belong to the tyrants. Because history is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember.